The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden glow. Children laughed as they played near the fountain, and the faint hum of a street musician's saxophone danced through the air among the bustling energy of the park. An unassuming man sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench. At first glance, he blended into the scenery like any other visitor, but a closer look revealed something peculiar. His faded brown jacket was frayed at the cuffs. His jeans were patched in places, and his scuffed boots looked as though they had walked 1,000 miles. He wore a worn-out baseball cap pulled low over his face, hiding his unmistakable identity: Keanu Reeves. Keanu sat with a sketch pad on his lap, the pencil in his hand moving methodically as he drew the rippling reflection of the fountain in the distance. No one passing by would have suspected this was the Hollywood star, known for his generosity and humility, let alone that he had a purpose. Beyond sketching the landscape, a police cruiser rolled to a slow stop at the park entrance. Two officers stepped out, their black boots crunching against the gravel path as they surveyed the area. Officer Carter, a young and ambitious cop, scanned the park with sharp eyes. His uniform was crisp, ice demeanor. Firm behind him was Officer Langston, an older, more seasoned officer who moved at a deliberate pace over there. Carter said, nodding toward Keanu. "Another vagrant making this place look like a campsite." Langston sighed, adjusting his utility belt. "He's just sitting there." Let's not jump to conclusions, but Carter was already moving, his steps brisk as he approached Keanu's bench. Keanu didn't look up as the officers arrived, his pencil continuing to glide across the page. "Excuse me, sir," Carter said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "This is a public park. You can't just loiter here all day." Keanu paused for a moment, lifting his head slightly. His expression was calm, his tone polite. "I'm not bothering anyone, just enjoying the day." Carter crossed his arms. "Enjoying the day, huh? What's in the bag?" He nodded toward a small, worn leather satchel sitting beside Keanu on the bench. Keanu looked at the bag and then back at the officer. "Just some pencils, a snack. Nothing illegal, if that's what you're asking." Langston stepped closer but remained quiet, his eyes studying the man's demeanor. "Mind if we take a look?" Carter asked, though. His tone made it clear it wasn't a question. Keanu exhaled slowly and leaned back slightly, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. "I need to remind you this is a public space, and that I have every right to sit here." The tension was palpable nearby. A young woman walking her golden retriever slowed her pace. Her curiosity piqued. She paused a few feet away, pretending to adjust her dog's leash while glancing toward the scene unfolding. Sir Carter continued, his patience thinning. "You need to move along. This isn't your personal lounge." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Is sitting on a bench a crime now?" Langston finally spoke up, his tone softer. "Look, we're just trying to keep the park safe and welcoming for everyone. We don't want any trouble." Keanu set his sketch pad down beside him, his gaze now steady on Carter. "Neither do I." The young woman couldn't stay silent. "Anymore, you not doing anything wrong," she called out, her voice firm but not aggressive. Carter turned toward her, his expression hardening. "Mom, this doesn't concern you, but it does," she replied, taking a step closer. "This is a public park. He has as much right to be here as anyone else." The crowd began to gather. Joggers, dog walkers, and curious passers-by slowed down, their attention drawn to the exchange. Keanu looked around, noticing the growing audience. He reached into his bag, and for a moment, Carter's hand twitched toward his holster. But Keanu simply pulled out a sandwich, carefully unwrapping it, as if the officers weren't even there. The nonchalant act seemed to unnerve Carter even more. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. Stepping closer, Keanu took a deliberate bite of his sandwich, chewed slowly, and then met Carter's gaze. "No, I think it's sad that you feel the need to harass someone for sitting in a park." Langston glanced at his partner, his expression tense. "Carter, maybe we should know." Carter interrupted this. "Guy thinks he's smarter than us. I'm not letting it go." The young woman pulled out her phone, recording the scene. Others in the crowd began doing the same, their murmurs growing louder. Keanu set his sandwich down, brushing crumbs from his lap. "You seem awfully determined, officer. Almost as if you have something to prove." Carter's face flushed red. "Watch your tone," he said through gritted teeth at this point. Langston turned to the crowd. "Folks, please keep moving. There's nothing to see here but no one." Budged. Keanu leaned forward. Lightly, his voice calm but firm. "Do you ever wonder how far you're willing to go just to feel in control?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Carter's jaw tightened, his hand twitching slightly at his side. Keanu looked directly into. "The crowd sometimes actions speak louder than words. If you think this is worth watching, hit one in the comments. Let's see who's paying attention." The crowd remained silent, their attention fixed on the scene. Keanu leaned back on the bench, his posture relaxed, but his sharp eyes never left Officer Carter's. The sandwich remained untouched on the bench beside him, but the tension in the air was anything but still. Officer Langston shifted uncomfortably, sensing that things were spiraling out of control. "Carter," he said, lowering his voice, "this isn't worth it. The guy's just sitting here." Carter ignored Ed. His frustration bubbling over. "You think this is a game?" he barked at Keanu. "You think you can just sit here, act all smug, and make me look bad?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression neutral. "I don't have to make you look bad," he said evenly. "You're doing that all by yourself." The words landed like a blow, and Carter took a step closer. His hand hovered near his belt, his body language brimming with barely contained anger. Langston stepped between them, raising a hand to his partner's chest. "Back off," he said firmly, his voice dropping to a warning tone. "You're making it worse." Before Carter could respond, a voice from the crowd rang out. "What's he even doing wrong?" It was the young woman with the dog again, her phone still pointed at the officers. "You're harassing him for sitting on a bench, seriously." Carter turned toward her, his face red with frustration. "This is a police matter," he snapped. "Stay out of it." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Another voice joined in, this time from a man in jogging gear. "We're all watching," he said, "and it doesn't look like he's done anything." Langston glanced at the growing group of onlookers, his jaw tightening. This was getting out of hand, and he knew it. Keanu, still seated, reached down and opened the flap of his satchel. Carter stiffened his hand, moving instinctively toward his holster. "Relax," Keanu said, calmly, pulling out a small, battered device. It looked like an old portable radio at first glance, but as he flipped a switch, a small red light blinked to life. "What's that?" Carter demanded, his voice sharp. Keanu didn't answer. Instead, he turned the device toward the crowd. "This," he said, his tone measured, "is a live streaming camera. Everything that's happened here has been broadcast in real time." The crowd murmured in surprise, and several people lifted their phones higher, capturing the officers' reactions. Langston froze, his eyes darting to the blinking red light. "You've been recording is this whole time?" Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "The world is watching now," he said simply. Carter's face turned a deep shade of red, his anger quickly shifting to panic. "You can't just record us without permission," he snapped. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "This is a public space," he replied, "just like you told me a minute ago. You're public servants, aren't you?" Langston took a step back, rubbing the back of his neck. "Carter," he muttered, his voice low. "We need to leave now." But Carter wasn't ready to back down. "You think this little stunt is going to scare me?" he said, his voice trembling with barely concealed rage. Keanu tilted his head again, his voice calm and steady. "It's not about scaring you," he said. "It's about holding people accountable." As if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. A black SUV pulled into the park, its lights flashing but its siren silent. The doors opened and a police captain stepped out, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the scene. "Officers," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "what's going on here?" Langston stepped forward quickly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Captain Monroe," he began. "It's just a misunderstanding." "We were." The captain held up a hand to silence him. She turned her attention to Keanu, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance and the blinking red light on the camera. "And you are?" she asked. Keanu stood slowly, his tall frame suddenly towering over the officers. He adjusted his cap and looked her directly in the eye. "Just a guy sitting on a bench," he said. The captain's gaze flicked to Carter, who was visibly agitated. "Officer Carter," she said, her tone dropping into something colder, more serious. "Step away," Carter hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Captain." I said step away," she repeated, her voice firm reluctantly. Carter took a step back, his frustration evident in every movement. The captain turned to Keanu. "Is there a reason this interaction needed to escalate?" Keanu shrugged lightly. "I was wondering." The same thing. Monroe's lips tightened into a thin line. She glanced at the crowd. The phones pointed in her direction, and then back at the live streaming device in Keanu's. "Hand, officers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Return to the cruiser and await further instructions. I'll handle this from here." Langston didn't argue, his shoulders slumping in relief as he turned and walked toward the car. Carter, however, lingered, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, glaring at Keanu. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply held the officer gaze for a long moment before speaking. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." Captain Monroe watched the two officers walk away, her eyes lingering on Carter, whose stiff posture betrayed his simmering frustration. Turning back to Keanu, she took a measured breath and gestured toward the bench. "May I sit?" Keanu nodded, stepping aside slightly to give her room. She lowered herself onto the bench, folding her hands in her lap. "I recognize you," she said, her tone even. "But I'm guessing this isn't just about you wanting some peace and quiet in the park." Keanu glanced at the blinking red light on his live streaming device before turning his gaze to her. "You'd be right," he said. "It's about what happens when no one's watching, or at least when people think no one's watching." Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll admit this doesn't look good," she said, nodding toward the small crowd that had gathered to watch. "And now, the entire world is watching thanks to you." Keanu's voice remained calm, measured. "Shouldn't the world be watching? Don't people have a right to know how they're treated by those who are supposed to serve and protect?" Monroe met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "They do," she said after a moment. "But I also have a responsibility to ensure my officers aren't vilified without due process." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not about vilifying anyone, it's about accountability. When someone abuses their power, there's no excuse for looking the other way." The crowd around them began to disperse slightly, though a few people remained nearby, their phones still recording. Monroe glanced at them briefly before speaking again. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, her tone sharpening. "Officer Carter will face a full review of his actions today, and if there's evidence of misconduct, he will be held accountable." Keanu nodded, his expression calm. "That's all anyone's asking for, fairness." Monroe stood, brushing off her uniform. "You've made your point, Mr. Reeves, but next time I'd appreciate it if you brought your concerns to the department directly instead of staging a public spectacle." Keanu chuckled softly, his tone light but laced with meaning. "Sometimes a public spectacle is the only way to get anyone to listen." Monroe didn't respond. Instead, she gave him a curt nod and walked toward the cruiser where Carter and Langston were waiting. As she approached, Carter immediately stepped out of the car, his frustration boiling over. "Captain, you're not seriously going to let this guy get away with enough?" Monroe snapped, cutting him off. "Hand over your badge and weapon." Carter froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You can't be serious," he stammered now. Monroe said, her voice low and cold with shaking hands. Carter unclipped his badge and holstered gun, handing them over reluctantly. His face burned with humiliation as the remaining crowd began to murmur. Langston looked away, his discomfort evident. The captain turned to Langston. "You'll be included in this review as well, Officer Langston," she said. "Consider this your warning. You had an opportunity to de-escalate and you failed." Langston nodded slowly. "Understood." Captain Monroe turned back to Carter, her gaze icy. "You're on administrative leave pending a full investigation. You're dismissed." Carter clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles white with tension. "This isn't fair," he muttered. "What's not fair?" Monroe replied, her voice like steel. "Is using your authority to intimidate someone who did nothing wrong," as Carter stormed off. Langston followed quietly, leaving Monroe standing alone. She looked back at Keanu, who had resumed sketching in his notebook. For a moment she hesitated, then called out, "Mr. Reeves." Keanu looked up, his expression neutral. "You've highlighted a real problem," she said, "but solving it takes more than exposing it. I hope you're ready to be part of the solution." Keanu gave her a faint smile. "I always am." Monroe nodded and walked back to the cruiser. The crowd, now much smaller, began to disperse completely. Keanu watched them go, his sketch pad still in his lap. He leaned down, pulled out a small piece of paper from his satchel, and wrote something on it standing. He placed the note on the bench, tucking it under Asmal rock to keep it from blowing away. The note read, "Justice isn't given. It's earned. Keep watching. Keep asking questions." As Keanu walked away, the camera on his live streaming device captured his retreating figure. His steps were measured, purposeful, as if he knew the impact of his actions would ripple far beyond the park back. At the B, a jogger paused, picked up the note and read it. He smiled softly, pulling out his phone to take a picture before placing it back where it had been. The bench, no empty, seemed to carry an unspoken message. Justice begins with awareness. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Keanu's live stream, now uploaded as a recording, had gone viral, amassing millions of views within hours across social media. The incident became a trending topic. The hashtags number, justice, on the bench, and number accountability matters dominated timelines as people debated shared stories and demanded systemic change. In the police precinct, Captain Monroe sat in her office, her expression a mix of weariness and determination. The screen of her computer displayed Keanu's video, paused on a frame showing Officer Carter looming over the unflinching man on the bench. She pressed play, listening to the dialogue again. "Justice isn't given. It's earned." Monroe leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. She knew this moment would ripple far beyond her department. It wasn't just about Carter or Langston. It was about rebuilding public trust, brick by brick. Meanwhile, at the park, the bench where Keanu had sat had become a quiet symbol. Visitors stopped to take pictures, read the note he left behind, and reflect on its message. A young woman, the same one who had defended Keanu earlier, returned with her golden retriever. She stood there for a moment, taking in the scene as she read the note again. An older man approached, his face lined with years of experience. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the bench. "What is?" the woman asked. "How something so simple, a bench, a moment, can spark something so big," he replied. She nodded, her grip tightening slightly on the dog's leash. "It's about more than the bench. It's about standing up when it matters." The men smiled faintly. "We could use more of that elsewhere." Keanu sat in a quiet diner, sipping a cup of coffee. His phone vibrated. On the table beside him, notifications flooding in, messages of support, stories of similar experiences, and even interviews from media outlets all clamored for his attention. A server approached, refilling his cup. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, but are you Keanu Reeves?" Keanu looked up, offering her a small, polite smile. "Depends who's asking." She chuckled nervously. "I just saw your video. What you did, it was brave." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes bravery is just doing what's right when it's not easy." The server paused, then said quietly, "Thank you. My brother had a run-in with the police a few years ago. It didn't end well, seeing what you did. It gives me hope." Keanu placed his cup down and looked at her directly. "That hope is what changes things. Don't lose it." Back at the precinct, Officer Langston sat in the locker room, his head in his hands. The weight of the day's events bore down on him. He had seen Carter cross the line, and he had done nothing to stop it. His inaction felt as damning as Carter's aggression. The door creaked open and Captain Monroe stepped in. She crossed her arms, leaning against the lockers. "Langston," she said. He looked up, his eyes weary. "Captain, you've been on the force a long time," she began. "Long enough to know when something's wrong." Langston sighed. "I should have stopped him. I knew it was getting out of hand, but you didn't." Monroe interrupted. "And that's a problem." Langston nodded slowly. "I don't have an excuse." Monroe studied him for a moment. Before speaking again, You'll have your chance to make it right. We're implementing new de-escalation training and I want you leading it." His head snapped up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You're serious?" "I am," she replied. "You've got experience, Langston. Use it to help others learn from your mistakes in the days that followed." The park bench became a focal point for conversations about accountability and justice. People left flowers, notes, and even small tokens of appreciation. Local news outlets covered the story, highlighting not just the incident but the larger issues it represented. Keanu, true to his nature, avoided the spotlight. He continued to quietly advocate for change, meeting with community leaders, and sharing the stories of those who had reached out to him. One afternoon, a young boy approached the bench with his father. The boy held a small bouquet of daisies, which he carefully placed on the seat. "Why are we leaving flowers, Dad?" the boy asked. His father knelt down beside him, pointing to the note still tucked under the rock. "Because this is where someone reminded us that everyone deserves respect. It's a lesson I want you to remember." The boy looked thoughtful, then nodded. "I'll remember." As the sun set over the park, the bench stood as a quiet testament to the power of small actions. And somewhere, walking along a quiet street with his hands in his pockets, Keanu Reeves smiled, knowing that change often starts with a single, unwavering moment of truth. Months passed, but the impact of Keanu's quiet act of defiance continued to ripple outward. The bench in the park had become a symbol of change, but it was more than that. It had sparked a broader conversation about accountability, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Community groups began holding events near the bench, using it as a gathering point for discussions, workshops, and even peaceful protests. Local leaders started paying attention, with some proposing reforms to improve training and transparency within the police department. Keanu stayed out of the limelight, but his presence lingered in the movement. His message, delivered so simply, resonated with people from all walks of life. Justice isn't given, it's earned. One evening, the park was unusually crowded. A community event was underway, with speakers sharing their stories of overcoming injustice. At the center of it all was the bench, now adorned with small plaques, bearing messages of hope and resilience. The young woman with the golden retriever who had been there the day Keanu stood his ground stood on a makeshift stage. She held a microphone, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "That day, I didn't know who he was," she said, gesturing toward the bench. "To me, he was just a man standing up for himself, and for all of us, he reminded me that we all have a role to play in creating change." The crowd applauded their energy. Palpable among them was Officer Langston, standing at the back with his arms crossed. He had taken his new role seriously, leading the department's de-escalation training and working to repair trust within the community. As the applause faded, Anston stepped forward, clearing his throat. The crowd turned to him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "I was one of the officers that day," he began, his voice low but clear, "and I failed. I failed to do the right thing when it mattered most, but I'm here today to tell you that I'm learning, and I'm listening." The crowd was silent for a moment before someone began clapping. Others joined in, their applause growing louder as Langston nodded and stepped back into the crowd. Meanwhile, Keanu sat in a quiet coffee shop not far from the park, watching a live stream of the event on his phone. He sipped his tea, a small smile playing on his lips as he listened to the stories being shared. The barista behind the counter approached cautiously. "I don't mean to bother you," she said softly, "but is that the event from the park?" Keanu nodded, tilting the screen so she could see. "It's amazing how much has come from that one moment," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You started something really special." Keanu set the phone down and looked at her. "I didn't start anything," he said. "I just gave people a reason to believe in their own power." The next day, the bench was featured on the evening news. A reporter stood beside it, recounting its significance and the changes it had inspired. Behind her, fam sat together, reading the notes and plaques left by visitors. The reporter concluded her segment with a powerful statement. "It's a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage can light the spark for something bigger in this park. On this bench, a quiet man made a loud statement, and the world is still listening." Back at the police department, Captain Monroe reviewed a series of reports on new community outreach programs. She glanced at the clock, noting it was nearly time for the next training session. As she stood to leave, her phone buzzed with a notification. She opened it to see an article titled, "From a Bench to a Movement: How One Day Changed the City." The accompanying photo showed the bench adorned with flowers, plaques, and handwritten notes. Monroe smiled faintly, pocketing her phone. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she also knew that progress had to start. Somewhere that evening, as the park quieted, a lone figure walked toward the bench. Keanu Reeves, dressed simply and without fanfare, sat down and took a deep breath. The faint sound of crickets filled the air, and the distant lights of the city twinkled. In the background, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through its page until he found a blank one with a pen. He scribbled something, quickly tore out the page, and left it on the bench. The note read, "The fight for justice is never over, but every step forward matters. Keep going." As Keanu stood and walked away, a gentle breeze carried the note, fluttering slightly before settling back. In place, the bench remained a simple yet powerful reminder of what could happen when one person chooses to stand up, speak out, and believe in the possibility of change. Months turned into a year, and the ripple effects of the incident in the park continued to spread. The bench, once a simple spot for rest, had become a symbol of hope and accountability. It was now referred to by many as the Bench of Justice. Visitors came from neighboring cities, drawn by stories of the quiet man who sat there and sparked a movement. Some left flowers, while others left notes sharing their own stories of injustice and resilience. A small plaque installed discreetly by the city council, dedicated to those who stand up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. One day, a school field trip stopped by the bench. A group of middle school students clustered around their teacher, who gestured toward the plaque. "This bench represents a turning point in our city's history," she explained. "It's where one person reminded us that even small actions can make a big difference." A boy raised his hand, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "What did he do?" The teacher smiled. He stood his ground and stayed calm. He didn't shout, didn't fight, but he made people think, and that was enough to change everything. The boy nodded thoughtfully, then sat down on the bench, staring at the fountain. In the distance, he took out a small notepad and wrote something on it, before slipping the note under a nearby rock. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves continued his work behind the scenes. He had refused countless interview requests, staying out of the public eye, while quietly meeting with activists, community leaders, and organizations working to address systemic issues. One afternoon, he tended a small private gathering in a modest community center. A group of young activists had invited him to speak, unaware of how much his presence would mean to them. Keanu stood at the front of the room, his demeanor humble as always. "I'm not here to tell you how to change the world," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "I'm here to remind you that the world can change because of you." The room fell silent as he continued. "The most important thing you can do is keep asking questions, keep challenging what feels wrong, and don't underestimate the power of small acts. Sometimes just sitting on a bench is enough to start a conversation." The audience erupted into applause, their faces filled with determination. Back in the park, Captain Monroe walked toward the bench carrying a single white lily. She hadn't been there since the day of the incident, but something had drawn her back. She sat down and placed the flower on the bench, staring at the fountain for a long moment. The park was quiet, the air cool and crisp. Her thoughts drifted to the changes within her department. New de-escalation protocols had been implemented. Community outreach programs had strengthened ties with neighborhoods, and officers like Langston had stepped up to lead by example. But Monroe knew there was still work to be done. The scars of mistrust ran deep and progress was slow. Yet sitting there, she felt a glimmer of hope. As the sun set, a figure approached the bench. Monroe looked up, surprised to see Keanu Reeves. Standing there, he carried the same satchel from that fateful day, though it looked less worn now. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She shook her head, gesturing to the space beside her. "Not at all." Keanu sat down, setting his satchel on the ground for a moment. They both sat in silence, watching The fountain's gentle spray catch the fading sunlight. Night, you've done a lot since that day, Keanu said, breaking the silence. Monroe glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. So have you. Keanu nodded slightly. It's a start. They sat quietly for a while longer before Monroe spoke. Again, do you think it's enough what we've done so far? Keanu's gaze remained on the fountain as he replied, change doesn't happen overnight, but every step matters, every choice matters. And the fact that you're asking that question, it means you're on the right path. As night fell, the park emptied, leaving the bench and its legacy under the soft glow of the streetlights. Keanu stood slinging his satchel over his shoulder before walking away. He turned to Monroe. Keep going. The world needs more people like you. Monroe watched him leave, her thoughts swirling with renewed determination. She looked down at the note still tucked under the rock on the bench, rereading the words, the fight for justice is never over, but every step forward matters. Keep going. With a deep breath, she stood, feeling the weight of her responsibility and the promise of change. A year and a half after that fateful day, the bench of justice had become more than just a symbol. It was a movement. Social media posts tagged with "Carn Justice on the Bench" were filled with stories from people around the world sharing moments where they stood their ground or witnessed acts of accountability. Local artists painted murals in the park, with one particularly striking piece featuring the silhouette of a man sitting on a bench, head tilted slightly. In quiet defiance below it were the words, "Justice begins." When someone dares to sit still, the movement extended far beyond the park. Universities invited activists and legal scholars to discuss accountability and systemic change. Nonprofit organizations rallied around the incident, using it as a case study to advocate for police reform in cities across the country. Justice Bench began appearing, simple park benches inscribed with messages of resilience, fairness, and courage. They served as reminders to communities that change often begins with small, deliberate actions. Keanu Reeves continued to work in the background, quietly funding programs aimed at community police dialogue and initiatives supporting de-escalation, training for law enforcement. He turned down every request for public appearances related to them movement, preferring to let the actions and voices of others take center stage. In a rare moment of reflection, Keanu shared his thoughts during a small gathering of activists. Change doesn't have a face, it has many. It's not about me, it's about all of us finding the courage to confront what's wrong and the patience to build something better. At the original bench in the park, visitors from across the country came to sit, reflect, and leave their own notes. Some wrote about their struggles with injustice, while others simply thanked the man who had turned a quiet moment into a loud St. Treat him. One evening, a teenage girl sat on the bench, clutching a notebook in her hands. She had come alone, drawn by the stories she had read about this place. Slowly, she opened her notebook and began writing. Sometimes I feel invisible, like no one hears me. But sitting here, I realize that even quiet voices matter. I promise I'll speak up even when it's hard. She folded the note and placed it under the same rock where Keanu had left his first message. Officer Langston's transformation had become a key part of the story, having fully embraced his role as a leader in the police department's reform efforts. He worked tirelessly to mentor younger officers and rebuild trust within the community. During a town hall meeting, Langston shared his perspective. I was there that day and I didn't do enough. I've thought about that moment every single day since, but it taught me something important. It's never too late to do better. The room erupted in applause, with members of the community recognizing his commitment to change. Captain Monroe, now promoted to Chief of Police, had turned the incident into a rallying point for her department. She introduced programs aimed at improving transparency and accountability, including an annual day of service where officers worked alongside community members to strengthen their bonds. During a press conference, she addressed the lasting impact of the movement. This isn't about one incident or one man. It's about creating a culture where accountability is the norm, not the exception. And while we've come a long way, we know the work is far from over. One quiet morning, Keanu Reeves returned to the park. He wore a simple black jacket and jeans, his familiar satchel slung over his shoulder. The park was empty save for the occasional jogger and a man walking his dog. Keanu approached the bench now adorned with plaques and a small display of flowers. He smiled faintly as he ran his fingers over one of the plaques. It read, "Justice isn't given. It's earned sitting down." He pulled out his notebook and a pen for a long moment. He simply stared at the blank page, listening to the bird, chirping and the faint sound of water from the fountain. Finally, he began to write to the person reading this. "You are not powerless. You are not invisible. The world changes when you decide to act. Never underestimate your impact." He folded the note carefully and placed it beneath the same rock where the first note had been left standing. He adjusted his satchel and glanced at the bench one last time before walking away. Years later, the bench remained a symbol of quiet resistance and transformative action. Visitors continued to leave messages, and the movement inspired by Keanu's actions grew into a global call for justice and accountability, though he had long since stepped away. From the public eye, Keanu's legacy endured not through his fame, but through the message he had left behind, that justice begins with one person daring to sit still and speak truth.